Welcome to the Flute NI. Join me, Aisling Agnew, as we explore the unique world of the flute in Northern Ireland. World-renowned players, teachers and makers from a wide variety of musical backgrounds share their experiences and expertise. This episode features the traditional Irish flute player, Reverend Gary Hastings. So, where am I talking to you from at the moment, Gary?
I'm in Killiney, South Dublin, and we're here about 3 years now this year. And I was Church of Ireland rector here. I was rector in Galway for 9 years, and I was in Westport in Mayo for about 14 years. So I was ordained then just before that, you know.
They're quite good places for music, all those places you've been as well.
They're good places, not where I am at the minute. There isn't a tune for miles in any direction, you know.
Okay, so it's self-made music where you are at the moment, is it?
Oh, well, I think that's the boat we're all in at the minute. As I play mostly now while I'm boiling the spuds in the evening. That's about the height of it, you know.
Tell me a wee bit about like growing up in Belfast and what got you started in playing the flute.
Well, I was from Woodstock, Ravenhill Road was where I was reared. My Uncle Billy, who was my great uncle, Patsy Patterson, lived in Ballarat Street down the Ravenhill Road. And I knew he played in the flute band, but by the time I was coming up, he had stopped. He was too old then. And there wasn't anybody else out of our ones who played in flute bands. I had cousins played in pipe bands, and I learnt the pipes myself at one stage. And there was Orange Men and all sorts, but that was the only band connection there was, really. So I learnt the pipes maybe for a year and a half, 2 years, and I learnt to play Abide With Me, Scotland the Brave, and God Save the Queen, and that was it. That was all I learnt. And Stand Up for Jesus, that was about the height of it, you know, and then I stopped then. But when I was at university was about 1975 or so, the Chieftains and the Bothy Band and Planksty and all that happened around that time. And I got very interested and started to learn the whistle then. And so I was, 18 or 19. And because I had played the pipes, learning the whistle was, you know, there was still something left in my fingers, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that hard to pick up. And there were other musicians in my year. I went to Coleraine to do physics, which I know why, but I shouldn't have anyway. But Kieran Curran was in the same year as me. He plays with Altan, you know, the group Altan. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Joe McHugh was a piper in the same year. Right. And in the university at the time, there were ones like Ethan Ullachheim. There's a whole gang of ones, singers and musicians of all sorts. And then there's a few more came in the year after that. And I did a couple of years of physics, and then the physics department myself sort of parted ways because I went there to learn physics and I came out able to play the flute, if you know what I mean. And I went and played. I played full time for a year or so. And then I went back to university and I did a degree in Irish studies. But by that stage, the place was swarming with musicians, and we were playing 6 nights a week. On the 7th night, you just went out and got drunk. That was about the height of it. But there was an awful lot of musicians and connections with other musicians. And so that's where the music came into my life then. Kieran Curran is from Fermanagh, from Kinawley. And I was just learning and I hadn't much of a clue. And Kieran had a background in music in the sense that his uncle Ned was a flute player. And Eamon Curran's a piper, is his cousin. He's from Monaghan. And so there was a background in music in Kieran's family. And Kieran knew Cathal McConnell. Cathal used to play with the Boys of the Loch. Mm-hmm. So he said, look, why don't you come up to Fermanagh and meet Cathal? So I went and stayed in the McConnell's house for 3 days. And I learnt more from Cathal in those 3 days than I did for maybe 10 or 15 years afterwards. Wow. He was so generous. He just gave me music with a shovel. And then they had what they called a music room. It was about the size of a small toilet, with a wee tiny bedroom, and it was full of music. reel-to-reel tapes and stacks of LPs and massive amount of stuff. It was a huge archive of stuff that they'd recorded themselves. So they'd gone round, and like Cahill would be in his still late 70s now, but him and his sister Maura, God rest her, had gone round and recorded old boys in their own county and Donegal and Leitrim and all over the place. And this whole archive of stuff was sitting there. So you would go into that wee room with McConnell, you would come out with your ears bleeding because he'd be playing, really hear this? Oh, here's another, you want to listen to that, and this by here, oh, and these tunes, and magic, absolutely magic. But Maura McConnell and Kieran Corn sat down and they made me 3 C90s. Are you old enough to know what a C90 is? It's a cassette tape. Okay, 90-minute cassette tape, right? They made me 3 of those. And they went through the whole archive and got this flute player and that flute player and these tunes and this and that. And like, it just dropped out of the sky into my lap, you know? Yeah. So I had the best repertoire tunes in the whole world, like ordinary stuff and really, really, really obscure stuff. Yeah. And old boys and 78s and all sorts. It was magic, absolutely magic. Except I lent them to Kieran Carson and the bugger lost them. But anyway.
That's what I was going to say. Do you still have them? You don't?
I wish I still had them. Oh, God, I wish I had them. Yeah, sure. Anyway, I have a piece of paper with the list of tunes on it somewhere that they wrote down. That's all. But don't lend anybody anything is the moral of that. But through that, like, I was able to, I suppose, inspired by you would never be able to get that kind of music. The commercial recordings didn't exist. Yeah. So we were learning from real old boys and from old books like O'Neill's 1001 and stuff like that there. But to be given your own personal archive, like that's 270 minutes of the best music going, you know, it just wasn't available then, you know. And that's how I got to be passable in the flute, because I had that and there was other good musicians about the place. So you weren't just sitting at home learning, you were able to play with these ones. Like I say, I was in the university in Coring, but I was up and down to Belfast. So I was in touch with, might have been the second year I was in university. I found out about other musicians in Belfast. I didn't even know they existed. Mm-hmm. Because the whole music thing was a very underground business during the Troubles. There were only certain pubs and it wasn't common knowledge. And anyway, it was a Catholic thing to do. And so there was no way somebody in my side of the house was going to even know it existed, if you know what I mean. Yeah. I got to know the ones in Belfast at the time, and there was, for example, Tara, who I know you've spoken to, and Dermy, and all the ones who were involved in Nabuhilly at the time, and Andy Dixon and Ben Gunn. And then there was a bunch of flute players, the same generation as myself, maybe a year or two older than me. It was about 6 or 7 of us. So there was Jerry O'Donnell and Hammy, who I know you've talked to, and Frankie Kennedy, God rest him, and Desi Wilkinson, Carsey, and there was about a half a dozen. Mm-hmm. And we all started out about the same time. And then only 2 or 3 years behind us, there was the likes of Brenton Carson. And there was ones of his age, but they were the next wave. They were the next generation from us, you know. Mm-hmm. So I was playing with them in Pat's Bar and Kelly Sellers on the Short Strand and all, you know, that's no longer there. So I got a great footing, but able to go to Fermanagh and meet real boys, you know, people who were actually in the tradition, had never left the tradition. All right, you read about them in books and you knew about people chatting about them and you saw them mentioned in LP covers, and then you got to go and talk to them and hear them and play tunes and all the rest of it. That was magic. That's something that young people growing up now, the nearest thing they get the real ones is the likes of me, because we met the real ones, if you know what I mean. Yeah. But the real ones are mostly gone. But there's ones like, for example, Seamus Quinn was at university with me. Father Seamus he's parish priest of Belcoo and half of Fermanagh as well. But Seamus was reared in the tradition with traditional music was the music round about him, and a big stack of 78s in the house. So the fact that he's very good at it and he's just steeped in it completely. And his father was reared over, you know, Ben Lennon and Charlie Lennon. Mm-hmm. His grandfather rather was reared over with them. Okay. They would have known him as an older fiddle player in their area, like, you know. So Seamus is coming, he's the real thing still, and he's younger than me by 3 or 4 years. But he's a rare animal in the sense that there's very few of him about anymore. Most people playing music are revivalists, a very strong term, but they're the likes of me that came in on the wave of stuff that happened in the late 60s and early 70s and thereafter, you know. when I was learning, there were still old fellas. I was up on the north coast, let's say, and there were still old fellas. Len Graham, his people were from Glenarm. Len would be mid-70s again, but the same age as Cal McConnell. But Len was living up there, and there was Jackie Devaney in there. Both Len's a very, very good singer. But there were singers like Joe Holmes, who back then would have been in the 70s, early 70s. But he was an old man. Men don't get really old now till they're in their 80s. But in those days, you were old by the time you got to 70, you know. And again, he was steeped in the tradition. Eddie Butcher was a famous singer from McGilligan, who was in his late 70s, early 80s. And to get to meet them, Hugh Shields went to Eddie to record stuff of him, and he had to go back and back and back, and he never got to the bottom of the well. The actual fact was that Eddie was getting other boys to give him songs to impress Hugh Shields when he would come back again, if you know what I mean. But Hugh Shields thought the well was, you couldn't plumb the well of songs he had. But those boys were about, as well as the ones in Fermanagh. So like we were able to meet people who had been in the tradition, but there was very few of them. Like I mentioned those names up on the North Coast. There weren't many more men or women of that generation when I was up there. The story in the North and South and the tradition changed a lot. So in the 6 counties when I started playing in the 70s, aside from people my age, there were only about 3 or 4 other flute players in the whole of the 6 counties. Mm-hmm. There was Cahill, Eddie Duffy. Have you heard of Eddie Duffy? No. He was an old, he was 91 or 2 or 3 when I started learning. John Joe the Puck. And James McMahon, who was from Fermanagh, but lived and died in Belfast, and had an ivory flute.
Right.
And there's a few tunes that have his name, you know, McMahon's. There's a tune called The Banshee, and that's actually James McMahon's tune. But anyway, that was it. That's all there was in the whole of Ulster. And then we started playing. So there was those 4 old ones, and then there was us. You know, you chat about the flute playing tradition in Ulster, but the flute tradition up north was gone. It only happened in Fermanagh. That flute tradition didn't seem to exist outside the Orange tradition. Fermanagh, there was a flute playing tradition that seems to have come from or be coterminous with Leitrim, Roscommon, Sligo, and Fermanagh. Mm-hmm. All seem to form the heart of Irish flute playing country, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
So Fermanagh just happened to be inside the E6, you know.
Yeah.
So the flute playing kicked off then in Belfast at that stage with about 5 or 6 players. Leslie Bingham, Tara's dad as well. And Leslie would have known James McMahon. But again, Leslie learnt. He wouldn't have been part of a native tradition. He was an outsider like me who learnt 30 years before us. So that was the story when I started playing and how Ulster was. Whereas in the South, the music didn't die off. Now, it wasn't very strong in most places. You know, outside Clare and the West Coast, and a lot of the West Coast counties still had a native tradition of song and dance and music that was very strong still. And in the rest of Ireland, it had kind of died out. The Dublin tradition existed because all the countrymen moved to Dublin, and that kept it going there. But Ulster, it seemed to have stopped. The whole playing for dancing, the whole living tradition thing seemed to have stopped very sharply after the war. In the South, it kept on going. So by the time we came along, there were very few old fellas. There was us, and then there was a massive gap between us and people in their 60s and 70s. I remember one day, Desi Wilkinson and me and Jerry O'Connor, we were teaching at some old thing or other, and the 3 of us were standing around one night, and somebody said, we're at, you know, when so-and-so dies, there's only us left, you know, because as regards the native tradition in Ulster, there was this huge gap. Now, we had met the old ones, you know, and we learned stuff off them. But then there was 40 years between us and them, which didn't happen in the South. In the South, there was continuity in lots of places, all the way down. There were always musicians playing a bit, but in Ulster, it seemed to stop dead. I think because it was more money and more records coming in and more work, wasn't the same kind of society, you know.
Yeah. Just kind of thinking about, you were saying about your great uncle playing the flute in Ravenhill, and then you started the flute when you were in Coleraine. Like, what kind of flute did you get hold of? What were you playing on at that stage?
I was playing the whistle for a while. I think one of the first flutes I got the hold of to play, we used to look at flutes in those days were awful. Like, you wouldn't have had a cow with them. They were desperate things. Well, like playing a table leg. I mean, there weren't any good flutes. When Malloy came along, the sound he made was amazing. Because our fellas didn't have good flutes and we didn't have good flutes, and Malloy was playing this thing was absolutely wonderful. I don't think it was the best flute in the world, but compared to what we were playing, the first flute I got my hands on for a long length of time was Jackie Devaney. Was a singer and a bones player from Coleraine. He's still going, and he got me the end of a flute, that belonged to a man who owned a pub on the waterside in Coleraine. And it was an 18th century boxwood baroque flute with one key. And it was bent like a banana. But I cleaned it out and oiled it up and hadn't been playing years and lapped all the joints and it played away. And I was the bee's knees because I had a flute that made a noise and you could play it, I had a wee band flute at some stage, but they're the devil to play there and they're sore in your ears. But I had this for a while, I remember. And there's a very obscene story, which I refuse to tell you in any kind of recording, to do with this flute, as to where the flute came from. But anyway, especially not by collar on. And I forget, I had that for 6 months or a year, I think. And there was a piccolo that went along with it. There must have been a set. If you had it now, it'd be interesting to see. There was no maker's name on it. I suspect it was made by Coyne from Dublin. Coyne was a pipe maker from Dublin and he made flutes in Ireland around that time, But it was a very early flute and I had to give it back then. I would get the loan of flutes, because you couldn't afford to buy one. At that stage, a flute was costing you 400 or 500 quid. And that was for an old Ruddle and Rose or a Ruddle and Cart or one of those English flutes. So I had the loan of flutes for a long time. First flute I bought was from Sam Murray. Sam was the cause of a lot of the strength of the flute tradition in Belfast. And that, all right, we had started to play flutes, the six or seven of us. And there was Marcus O'Murchu as well. He was part of that next wave, if you know what I mean. When we started playing, we were playing old flutes. But then Sam started making them and I bought a flute off him. Not one that he'd made. He hadn't started then. It was a Willis flute. And Willis worked with Ruddle and Rose. And it was a nice flute with square-headed keys on it that you don't see. And he charged me for far too much, of course. But anyway, sure, he didn't know. And actually, he probably didn't know either. He was working in the Folk Museum at the time. He started making flutes. And it was the fact that flutes were available in Belfast. Suddenly meant that people could start, it was achievable, because the old flutes were quite rare, never mind being expensive. There weren't that many in the world, if you know what I mean. And most of them were desperate. They were awful. They're all over the place. They were out of tune. The things we were playing, Jerry O'Donnell had one, the pads had come off and we didn't know anything about it. So he had it blocked. Remember, it was chewing gum covered in silver paper stuck into the keys. And everybody, you weren't a real flute player till you'd insulating tape all over your flute to block up the cracks and the holes and where the pads didn't work. Or I had one flute actually I was given, and it was a pin-mounted Blackwood German thing, and they weren't that good. But the bottom D was so far out of tune. You know the way pipers stick rushes up their regulators, if you excuse the phrase, and they can tune the regulator by getting a longer. Well, I tried that. So I got a bit of a coat hanger and bent it around in a U shape so that it would show up the inside of the bore of the flute, and I wrapped it in string. It actually meant the D was so muffled it didn't matter whether it was in tune or not, but at least it didn't sound with a big honk. So really awful instruments, desperate instruments. But there was, most of the ones I've mentioned were very good flute players. If they'd have been given a very good instrument then, they'd have been flying, But all we had was enthusiasm. That was about it.
Well, it didn't stop you anyway.
No, that and the drink was a great help,
Gary, did your family react all right to you playing Irish music?
Yeah, because it was music, just full stop. The politicisation of culture, I wrote a thing on that years ago. The culture became politicised back in the 1890s when the Gaelic League started, the Gaelic League, the GAA, and then Irish culture became Irish with a capital I, and Irish music, suddenly instead of just been music, became Irish music. And traditional, even worse, Whereas before that, there was just music that boys played the dance to. Well, when that cultural identification happened in the late 18, early 1900s, Northern Ireland Unionists, I think especially in urban areas, took a complete step back from it. Actually, in rural areas, they were still playing it because there wasn't any other music. And that lasted right up to after the Second World War. So like I was saying earlier, one of the reasons for that huge gap of age between us and the generation above us in the music was due to Protestants not having anything to do with it in urban areas, and also because they were the majority population, I think that influenced everybody else as well. I went on to do Irish studies, which was through Irish. So I had to learn Irish. We had no Irish at school, like. And I had to do, it was an intensive 1-year course in Irish, and then the rest of the degree was in Irish. So you had to get from board and Mona up to A level in 6 months, which isn't good for your head. But they didn't know anything about it. The Irish language and the music thing are related in the sense that my granny didn't know there was such a thing as an Irish language, because where would she come across it? Like it said, Céad Míle Fáilte in a tea towel, but sure, that might as well have been Latin, and it was no big deal, You didn't see Irish anywhere else, and you didn't come into contact with it. Bord na Mona was the only other bit of Irish you would have seen on an ordinary day's walking in Belfast. That's the only Irish you would have seen. Now it's a different ballgame, but not then. And the whole politicization of the thing really ramped up as the 70s went on. Yeah. When I started doing it, it was nationalists did that, and that was their music. But the fact that it was music was all right, because everybody likes music. So the music transcends the boundaries to some extent. The trouble was where you had to go to play it in Belfast.
Okay.
Because there was only Pat's Bar. It wasn't too bad, but Tom Kelly's was up a short strand. That was Indian country, even for Catholics, that was Indian country, because it was in a bad spot, just, because the Ravenhill Road was here and the short strand was there and Kelly's was just here. I was coming home from university and I go in there to play tunes on a Saturday night. And I never said to me man and dad where I was going. So my Uncle Roy was involved, my dad's brother was involved in various outfits, which will remain nameless. And he called around one time to see my gran, and he says, "Near a minute." I says, "What?" He says, "You played music in Tom Kelly's bar, the Short Strand." I says, "Aye." I was going, "How under God did he know, He says, "Aye." He says, "Well, look," he says, "I'm sure they're very nice people in there." He says, "There's a lot of boys watching that place that aren't very nice." He says, "And I haven't got a good suit to go to your funeral." All right. So I didn't go back to Tom Kelly's after that. When you're warned once, So, and like Tom Kelly's had anti-missile emplacements outside and all sorts, it was in a bad spot. But they knew who I was going in. So when you get tips like that, you're well staying clear. We used to play when I was at university in the Harbour Bar in Portrush, and there was no big deal. The locals assumed you were Catholic, basically. And I remember there was one big man who is no longer with us. Big man, he's good crack. And he was drunk one night and he got the hold of me and he got me in an arm lock and he was going, "Get out of that, you big Catholic bastard." And I says, "Hold on, big Methodist bastard." And he fell about laughing then. And he bought me a drink because he thought that was great crack. Because they just assumed if you're doing that, you must be. But it wasn't a problem because Portrush and Portstewart wasn't quite the same big deal. In Belfast, you were careful. I never had a problem. I mean, I was knocking around with Catholics and playing with Catholics and going to Catholic bars and occasionally you go back to parties and stuff, and nobody ever said anything to me because they all knew, and boys were able to say he's with us, and that was okay. I remember being in a pub on the Grosvenor Road once, we were playing tunes, and after a while a man came over and he says, "Just sussing you out there, boys, we know who you are now, that's all right, play away." And then you would rewind the tape and go, "Whoops, right, you knew what had been going on, only you weren't aware." So there's a bit of that. But to me personally, as a prod, knocking around with the other side all the time, if you know what I mean, nobody ever said a bad word to me, or a bad thing was never done. But again, I was going around talking Irish, playing music. So the musicians didn't actually care. Musicians didn't care who anybody was. Everybody knew because you had to know. If you live up north, you need to know. Not for a sectarian reason, but because you don't want to cause any offence. And it's actually better if the other person knows what you are and then they won't offend you. That's part of it. It's not just sectarianism. It's more to it than that. You're from Belfast, you know what I mean? So the fact you play music means you've already got a card in, but everybody knows who you are. Like Tara's dad, Leslie, they used to slag him. I remember him arriving in the session in the middle of it, and boy said, "Well, play the sash, go away home, Leslie, you're too late," But that was all right. Everybody knew who everybody else was, and they were all musicians. They're more interested in if you could play, how good you were and what you were playing than in what you were. It wasn't a big deal. Very rarely came up, a bit of slag in an odd time. Mostly it didn't come up,
So just to go back to your studies, there's a bit of a curveball between going to study physics first and then Irish and then where you're at now with being rector of Church of Ireland. Is that right?
Perfectly natural move, madam, actually. No. Well, I went to do physics, but I discovered music and wee girls and drinking cigarettes all around the same time. So the physics hadn't a chance, basically. And I was doing the wrong course. I shouldn't have been there at all. But it seemed like a good idea at the time to me, so that was the way it worked. But then I was very interested in Irish, because why wouldn't it be? And the music was all happening at the same time, and I knew all the boys involved, and it was fast. It was very exotic for me coming from East Belfast, where you had never knowingly met a Roman Catholic till you were 17 or 18, and suddenly you go to university and the place is swarming with them, and you had never thought about it before, and it wasn't a big deal. But you assumed they were going to be very different, whereas they were more or less the same as you. And some of them came from just up the road from you, only you didn't know. So it was, both Irish and the music were very exotic to me, which was fascinating. I remember meeting a girl in Korean who was from Gweedore, and I had just got Brendan Brannock's book, Ceol Drink in the Heron, had just come out, I think, around the time. But it was all in Irish, and all the tune titles were in Irish, and I was asking her what the devil they meant. And she had in English for most of them. I remember being amazed. She was a native speaker, she was my age, and her English was actually pretty ropey, because she had never needed to speak English. This is only an hour's drive up the road. It was amazing to find people like that in your own country you never knew existed. Yeah. So that was all fascinating stuff, So that was one element in it. And then, as I say, I went back and I did Irish, and then I married Katrina in New Galahad, and we lived up in Port Stewart till about 19. I think we moved in 1983, we went down to Galway then. I went on to train for this Lark in 1989, 1990. So that was it.
So you've lived like in the south since then, you have?
We're in the south 26 years now, or something like that, yeah.
And tell me a bit about what you would be up to with your playing normally, like obviously pre-COVID.
Well, where I am now, devil and all, because I'm, whatever tunes there are, either an hour that direction or an hour in this direction, and to drive an hour and you couldn't have a drink when you got there, and it might be rubbish anyway, means you're less likely to go out. So since we came here, I wasn't playing at all, hardly a bit in the house. Galway, I'd have gone out playing every week, not gigs, because like when you're in my job, the weekends are out and everything happens at the weekends. So, and we only get, 4 weekends off a year like anybody else. So it meant that festivals and stuff like that I would have been playing at all the time and teaching in Miltown, Malbay, whatever, really just doesn't happen, So the music took second place, but I would go out on the Wednesday night in Galway. We played in a wee pub in Galway every Wednesday night for 10 years. And then I played in Matt Malloy's in Westport for the whole time I was there as well. So.
Fantastic.
Good crack. Bad for your health.
Flute do you play on now? I assume you're not still playing on the banana-shaped Baroque flute.
Oh no, I haven't got like to give the banana-shaped flute back. No, I have a Sam Murray, one of Sam's flute that I played up until a while ago, and then I got there's a man called Martin Doyle, who's a dub, but he lives in the Hinch in Clare, and he makes very nice flutes.
I have one as well.
They're good.
Yeah, lovely.
And I got another one there in March. I just took a notion, and I asked him for another one, and he made it. Like normally you ask for a flute and 6 months afterwards you have to start hassling the boy, if you know what I mean. Well, 3 weeks afterwards he says, I'll have that in the post to you. I goes, what are you talking about? He says, I've it made. So, all right. So we got it. So that kept me sane. So because I just spent an hour, I wasn't playing at all. Like I hadn't had the flute out of the box for 2 or 3 years. So I had to start playing again. It's very sore. Never stop. Jesus, whatever you do, never stop. Sore on the back and, which are pains, and your hands start to cramp and all sorts of things. Desperate. But it obliged me to do it. Having spent the money, the wife would kill me if I hadn't done something about it. So I was playing for maybe up to an hour a night for a while there. I've stopped again for a while this last while. But I would play now when I'm making a fry or boiling spuds. I would be playing tunes in between, turning things over in the pan, But that's about the height of it, And
are the flutes that you have, are they different keys or anything, or are they all...
No, there was a Blackwood was the first one he made me, but there was no tuning slide on it.
Okay.
And I got him to make me one as cocos wood, but the tone's far nicer. And there's a tuning slide on it, and it's a very nice machine entirely. But it's the first one was extremely easy to play, which is good when you get to my age. I'm telling you, the breath does get slightly scarcer. And this one, you have to put your shoulder behind it a bit, but it's very nice.
That sounds beautiful. I mean, you must be kind of busy, like in normal times anyway, like just even in life. Like, do you get a chance to listen to people these days? Is there anybody that you'd say like influences you still in your playing?
Well, the influences are there from long before. I'd be looking at Facebook all the time. There's every bloody idiot in the world has stuff up on Facebook now, including a shower of tubes who couldn't play music if you hit them with a stick, like, you know, and they're putting up videos of themselves. I'm only practicing, so I put this up. Like, no. Anyway, sorry, excuse me, rant there. So I would hear boys there, and you hear all sorts of ones, and some very good ones entirely. There's some very good music coming out of America now. Traditional music is changing, and that there's a lot of very flashy commercial players who are playing for a living, and they have influenced the whole thing a lot. So there's a lot of flashy music going about, but there's a lot of other people who are playing very good, solid, decent, real stuff like it should be. And they might be pushing the envelope a bit, but they haven't actually cut it up into wee bits and run away with something else. You know, there's a lot of music out there now should probably just be called Celtic music, because it uses traditional instruments, and it might use traditional ornamentation, and it might smell of Irish music, but I think it has stepped over the fence and moved on somewhere else. There's people like Tommy Peoples, for example, was able to push the envelope with the music and develop the music within the tradition, and in the way the tradition would have gone had it been the way it used to be. You cannot stop development and change and everything else. That'd be daft. But I think we're obliged to defend and preserve our genre of music in a world where music is just music. It used to be music meant something. Maybe it was just for dancing, that was grand. Nobody needed to think about it because everybody knew what it was. But nowadays, you can use a wee electric box with earphones and you can get any sort of music in the world anywhere, which means all musics have now floated out into the same level. There's pop music, and then there's world music, and then there's classical music. And that's about it, really. Do you know what I mean? Everything is now leveled out to much the same thing and is under the same influences, and everybody is subject to the same cultural influences through the net. So there's a big equalizer going on. I think we have to fight against the equalizer, which doesn't mean Joe Bloggs can't tear off into the darkness and play the way he wants. Good luck to him, you know. But somewhere we have to draw a line and defend the line and say, we need to keep this going because this is nice, which is why I started playing it. One of the reasons I liked it was it wasn't the same as anything else. It was special. There was something special about this because it was different. And it wasn't American folk music, and it wasn't English, and it was a wee bit like Scottish, but it wasn't Scottish. But they have a very special thing too. And there's very special things everywhere. But this is our very special thing. And you can lose it. Like you can lose a dialect, or you can lose a language. It can be gone in the morning and nobody would know because it has turned into something else. So our music could turn into something else, which is paddywhackery and might be nice in inverted commas, but you'll have lost the real thing, you know. I think. I'm not trying to be absolutely purist, but I think there's a good reason to try and preserve the pure core of something. You never can. I play in a tradition. I don't play exactly like so-and-so. Even if I only listen to John, what's his name? The big famous flute player in the 70s. Even if I only listened to him ever, never listened to anybody else, I still wouldn't play like him. Yeah. I'd be a cheap imitation. So I don't play like Cal McConnell, though he'd be one of the big influences in me. And I don't play like Matt Malloy, though whether you like it or not, Matt is a big influence in all modern Irish flute players and all. So I'm part of a tradition, but it's madness, how do you say, to let the tradition run into the sand. It'd be nice to keep a current going.
It sounds like you're doing a good job preserving it as well.
I'm bluffing. Kieran Carson, God rest him, asked me to do something. When I was at university, there was one unit you could do was in folklore. And as part of the folklore thing, I said, right, I'll do something that I'd like to do something in Orange bands. Kind of went round to see my Uncle Billy. who was 80-something at the time, you see. He was telling me about the Ravenhill and flute bands and all the rest of it. But then he says, there's a wee man around, I'm going to say a wee man over the road here, he says, makes his own shoes, he says. And he makes heads for lambic drums. He says, you talk to him, he says. So he took me around to meet this wee man who was called Rab McLeish. And Rab was great crack to talk to. He had a wee 2 up, 2 down off the Ravenhill Road. He used to slaughter goats in the backyard to get the skins off them and all, you know, amazing. And he was making hides to put the heads in lambic. Good crack. And he introduced me, he took me to Hillsborough, the drumming match, and I got them. So I did my essay for the folklore unit on this here, because there's nobody had ever written anything about it at all or done any kind of study on it at all. So Carsey, years later, said, would you write something on that? He says, because there's nothing. So I said, all right. He gave me money, he being the Arch Council, and I went and recorded boys and tried to find out how it all worked. But again, I was coming in from outside and you're doing it relatively quickly. So, but I wrote a book on it, which I can send you a copy of if you like.
Yeah, for sure.
What I found, put briefly, was I was coming as a traditional musician and I was doing the work up in Mid-Antrim, and there was John Kennedy. Have you heard of him?
I don't think so.
He died there last year, the year before, in his 80s. And John was a flute player and a fifer and a whistle player. And there was another wee man called Willis Patton from Cullywacky, the two of these boys. And they were both magic traditional musicians, but they were also prods and they were also fifing for lambics on the 12th day, which fascinated me. When I discovered that, I was amazed. So I started chatting to them, and they used to play. And an old man they introduced me to, Willie Nicol, who would have been 80 back in, say, 1978 or 9. And Willie, they used to play for dances as well as playing fifes on the 12th. Which when you come from Belfast, that doesn't make sense, because in Belfast there's orange music and then there's Celtic music. You know, that's most people's mindset. You know, they do that and we do this. Whereas what I discovered then was lots of rural places, the dance tradition didn't die out until the 60s maybe. Right. Or in County Down, in some places, there's still old ones dancing, the fiddle players doing lancers and quadrilles and highlands and all sorts of stuff in County Down in orange halls, and they're all prods. Still. You know, so those things survived. And I suddenly discovered that this was a fact. And the repertoire of music the fifers played was 90% traditional dance music. Right. I thought there was an orange repertoire of the sash and Derry's Walls and all those things that you would know from here in the 12th. No, they didn't play them. They played fifing tunes. And the fifing tunes, a lot of them were jigs put into hornpipe time, or reels put into hornpipe time, or hornpipes in hornpipe time. And then there were fifing tunes, and I never got to the bottom of this. You couldn't transpose them into any other rhythm. These had obviously been written to play for drums, and they were very strange tunes. They were nice, but I don't know what was going on there. Why was everything in hornpipe time? You can march to jig time, or you can march to march time. These boys were playing in hornpipe time. Very, very strange, and I never got to the bottom of that because there's no documentation anywhere. Completely oral culture. So how do you find out? You know?
Yeah.
So I was amazed to find out how the two traditions only go back to the early 1900s. Before that, there was just music. So when you wanted music to march to and you were an orange man, you used the music that was in the air, and you might have mucked about with it a bit. And a lot of the stuff that we would consider as being partisan, as being party tunes, actually were used by both sides. Only it depended the words you sung to the tune. I mean, the sash is only an orange tune because of the words you sing to it, for example. But the Boyle Orange Heroes of Cumber is the same tune as the Boyne Water, is the same tune as Roscahannamuan. And the Swallow's Tail is actually the Shanghai Lilt, which is a big standard orange march that you'll hear in the 12th anytime. So the traditions were only separate since my grandparents' time, that's all. Yeah. That was amazing to find out. Never mind to do all the work on lambics and fifes, which is a wee cultural pocket all of its own. But then to find out that it was actually part of a wider tradition, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating.
There's an extra bit. I won't charge you for that.
Well, I think your stories are amazing, Gary. Thank you so much for sharing them with me.
You're very welcome. May it do you good.
Join me next time when I'll be speaking to the classical flute player and military musician Richard Douglas.